Over the last couple of weeks, I have started uploading free PBR textures on my website CC0Textures.com, and pretty much ever since I started, I have received one question. How do you actually make these? What does it take to create a PBR texture? To answer your questions, I have made this little walkthrough on how you can create your very first PBR material from scratch. So what do you need for that process? Now, since this tutorial is aimed at beginners, you will not need any fancy and expensive material creation software. We'll work with two free tools: Microsoft Ice, a panorama stitching software, and GIMP with a special normal mapping plugin, which I'll show you how to install later on. You will also need a decent camera, preferably with a tripod. You can use your phone if you really want to. In that case, make at least sure that you disable as many of the automatic image corrections and filters as possible. If you have a DSLR or something similar at hand, make sure that you are shooting in the highest quality, preferably RAW, and set it to a very low ISO value. But another aspect that might be even more important, at least if you are shooting outdoors, are the weather and lighting conditions. Generally, you should try to get very flat and uniform lighting, so avoid shooting in bright sunlight. Rain can also be a problem. Not only does it make the entire surface a lot more reflective than it usually is, it can also leave some very annoying dark spots long after the downfall itself has stopped, so look out for that. If you are planning on making your very first texture, I would suggest starting with some tiles or paving stones, since editing them is a lot easier than, say, ground textures. So set up your camera and start taking several pictures. Move your camera along in a grid of maybe 3x3 or 4x4, and make sure that you have some overlap between the images so that it is actually possible to piece them together later on. Once you're done, copy the files to your computer. Okay, time to start editing. I've got my raw images here, so I'm just going to open that folder like this, and if you just select all of them and right click, you'll get this option, Stitch Images using Image Composite Editor. If you don't get that option, just open the editor the regular way and just drag and drop all those images in there. Okay, now we are in Microsoft Ice. In here, we actually don't need to do a lot, just select planar motion, because we just moved along the surface on just one planar motion, as it says. Then just continue onwards to step 2, stitch. Now it's going to stitch all of your images together. That's going to take a while, but we don't have that many images, so it's relatively quickly. You can see, and you can now check if everything looks okay. Yeah, I'm quite happy with this result. So just move on to crop. Now, I'm not actually going to crop that image. I'm going to do that later in GIMP. So just ignore this step and move onwards to export. Now here, when you export, it's very important that you choose a lossless file format. So by default, it's set to JPEG image with a quality of 75, which is very low in my opinion. So just change that to something like TIFF if you want to. Then just click on Export to Disk and select the folder you want to export this into. I'm just going to call that raw tiles. Save. And we're done. You can now close Microsoft Ice. You can save your project if you want to. I'm just going to quickly do that. But we shouldn't need it, so you can also just delete it. Okay. Now if we go into our folder, we have this really huge 70 megabyte image of our texture, and we can now start processing that in GIMP. Now, before we do this, if this is the first time that you are trying to create textures using GIMP, you'll need to install the GIMP Normalmap plugin. I've put the link in the description. This will take you to the download page so you can get it for Windows 64 or Windows 32. It will give you this zip file, which I've unpacked here. So this zip file will just contain the normalmap.exe file and 3 DLL files. And included in there is also a README that tells you how to install this. I'm just going to roughly show that. So basically you're just going to extract the normalmap.exe and put that into this folder. And you're going to take the 3 DLL files and put them in this folder. So for me, this means that I just have to go to my installation folder, which looks like this. I've installed this on a different drive, that's why the path is different. And then just navigate to where it tells you to go. So for me that would be GIMP 2, which I'm in currently, lib GIMP 2.0, and then plugins. And here I would import my normalmap.exe. So this one, I'm not going to do this because I obviously already have it installed. So you would just copy that. And then you'd go to GIMP 2, back to your installation folder, into the bin folder. And there you would just paste in the DLLs. You can see there are already quite a few DLLs in there by default. So you'll just have to add those there. And then you can use GIMP to generate normal maps, which is going to be important later on. So I'm just going to quickly close that. And now we can actually open up GIMP. On this screen maybe. Okay, now it's time to open up your image. So just grab it and drop it into GIMP. Here it is, and that's the image we just created. Now the first step in here is to just use the rectangle select tool and mark out the area that you want to tile roughly. It doesn't need to be perfect, so for me that's this 5x5 grid here. So I'm just going to roughly mask that out. I'm going to leave a bit of space around it, like so. And now we'll adjust the image to exactly fit this canvas. To do that, go to Image, Guides, and first of all create new guides from selection. If you click this, you'll see that it creates these blue helping lines that are going to be very useful in the next step. Now make sure that your entire image is selected, so just go over it with the select tool once, and then use the perspective tool. Just click on it and it will give you those 4 points that you can use to control the image or to move it like that. And it will also give you this little floating window. So go to any edge of your image and use this control handle to move it into position. So for me this means I want the seams between the tiles to exactly line up with my blue guidelines. So for that I'm going to zoom out a little bit and I'll just go like that, and basically I'll just repeat that for all 4 edges. So like this, move up like this, and in the top right like so. Now this seems to be it, but if we go back to the bottom right corner where we started, you'll see that it actually shifted a little bit because we moved all the other edges, and that's how the perspective tool works. Now there is also this what's it called, this cage transform tool in GIMP that should technically make this process easier, but at least in my opinion it's very slow, very glitchy, and it takes forever to calculate. So That's why I'm using the perspective tool. Now sadly this means that we'll have to readjust our edges a little bit, so just make you round around the image for a second time and just move them in position. Okay, and this one. So now if we look, all 4 edges should be aligned to our blue grid. I'll maybe rearrange that a little bit over here and over here. Alright, so now zoom out. This is what it's going to look like, and click transform in your little floaty window. This might take a while depending on your computer. Just wait, even if it says that it's not responding, don't worry, it is working. Okay, now we have our new perfectly aligned image as a floating selection. We want to turn that into an actual layer, so just right click on it and select to new layer. Now it also left us with this empty white layer. Just delete that, we don't need it. Now we have our transformation layer, which looks like that, and you can see our layer is now actually bigger than our image because we rearranged it, and we don't want that. So we'll have to adjust the canvas that GIMP uses, and fortunately there's a very easy way to do that. Just go to image and then say fit canvas to layers, and you'll see it will just make the image a little bit bigger so that it actually can contain this transformation layer. Okay, now we can actually start on making it seamless. So go back to your rectangle select tool and select one of the sides. I'm going to use the right side like this. You could also use this area if you want to. It doesn't really matter, it's just personal preference. I'm just going to use this one like so. Then just hit Ctrl C and immediately paste it with Ctrl V. So we have a new floating selection, which again we'll have to turn into a new layer. So if you've done that correctly, you should now have your main transformation layer, which just is the image that we started with, or the adjusted image. And then you should also have this new pasted layer, which is just this part. Re-enable both of them, make both of them visible again. Now select your pasted layer, use the move tool, and then just grab it. While doing so, hold down the Control key, so it will actually only move that in one direction. You can see I can move my cursor, but it won't jiggle around with the image. So just move it and put that to the right side of your left guideline, like this. So if we now zoom in, you'll see that we've actually copied this part of the image onto here. And now, since this part is by nature seamless to this one because it's part of the same image, this part is also going to be seamless to this part, and therefore we now have an image that is seamless on the x-axis. But obviously we've cheated a little bit. Basically we've just moved the seam, it's now over here and it looks absolutely horrendous, so we'll need to fix that. To do that, first of all, we need to get rid of this yellow line because it makes it really hard to see the transition. So just go to your pasted layer, right click on it and say layer to image size. And basically that will just extend the layer to the whole canvas and we no longer have this annoying edge that we don't really need. Then go to your pasted layer again and add in a layer mask. For this purpose, I'm going to use a white one with full opacity, like this. Now right click on it and make sure that it's set to edit layer mask. Because now what we can actually do is we can take a brush and use a dark color to hide this pasted layer, or a light color to make it visible again. So now just zoom in, and if we try that out very quickly, I'm going to increase the scale here. You can see that we can just paint over this, and we now have a transition between the two images that is pretty seamless, I would say. So just go through that. Now if that's a bit too tedious for your taste, you can also use a gradient tool. So just use that and move in. Again, you can hold down the Control key to make it snap to different directions, so that it actually creates a perfectly horizontal gradient, and then just let go of it, and you'll see that we have this perfect gradient, and the transition between the two is pretty smooth actually. Yeah, you can see it. There are a few problems over here, but those are really small, not big enough to be really noticeable. And yeah, we now have an image, or let's say an area of an image, that is seamless on the x-axis. So we could now technically copy this inner square and just paste it next to this one, and there would be no seam over here. So now we just need to repeat that for the other part of the image, for the y-axis. So again, grab your rectangle tool, select the bottom area, like so. Press Ctrl C and then just Ctrl V to copy and paste it. Turn the floating selection into a new layer, and then use the Move tool to move it upwards while holding Ctrl so that it stays aligned to the image. Again, the image is now technically seamless because we don't have a seam over here, but we obviously have this huge seam over here. So right click on your new layer and say layer to image size. So we've gotten rid of this yellow line, and then again add in a layer mask, a white one. Alright, now zoom in a little bit and just get out the brush or your gradient. I'm just going to use the gradient and remove all the parts of the image that you don't want. Now in general, what you want is a pretty long transition because that's less obvious, like so. And we can now see, if we zoom in, that we have a pretty good transition. Now it's, as you can see here, these tiles happen to be a bit lighter than the ones on the bottom. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to grab a brush, and I'm just going to set that to a dark color at a pretty large size, like 700 maybe. And I'm also going to make that pretty smooth with maybe with a slightly lower opacity of like 40. And then I'm just going to remove a bit of that darkness down here, because that's honestly more than what we need here. So just, I'm probably going to make that a bit more subtle. Just a really subtle effect. Basically it's there to just hide this transition, because if you look, you can clearly see that all the tiles start out very light and then gradually become darker, and by adding in a few random spots, we can actually make that we can actually hide that a little bit. So that's not necessary. You can just experiment and find out what works best for you, for your scene, for your texture. In this part, you really just have to try out different styles. But obviously, don't delete any of the pixels right near the edge, because those are the ones that are responsible for actually making a tile. So keep that in mind. And again, one really beautiful thing here, since we're using a mask layer, let me just show you that. We're using a mask layer. You can actually let me just hide that. So you can actually use a white brush, and if you now notice, oh, maybe that transition has gotten a little bit too extreme, the gradient is very short, you can just take a brush and add in a bit of that other image again. So that's really convenient. I'm not going to continue on with this for much longer, because this is just for the purpose of a tutorial. If you wanted to make a real texture with this, you'd probably spend a bit more time here on making sure that the theme looks decent. But that's again just something that you can play around with as you go. Just tile it or open it into your scene and into the scene that you want to use it in, and then just see if it works, and if it doesn't, just go back and tweak the colors a little bit. Alright, I'm just going to leave it like that for now, and again I'm going to right click on my layer and I'm going to merge that down onto our main layer. So congratulations, we now have a seamless image. We just need to get rid of those parts around it. So again, time for the rectangle tool. Just make a rough selection and then grab the edges like this and move them to the guides until they snap. Like so, and on the bottom. Yeah, and then just click image, image, crop to selection. And boom, that's your texture right there. We can now move on to the maps. Alright, so how do we create maps from our image? For a PBR material, or for the sort of PBR material that we are going to create, we'll need a displacement, a normal, and a roughness map. So first of all, so that we can keep track of what we're doing, just rename this layer that you already have to color, so that you know what it is, and then make a duplicate. Now, if we go to colors, you'll find the option desaturate. If you do that, you'll basically just get a black and white version of your image. And if you look at it at first, that might seem to be really good. You know, the themes are somewhat darker, the tiles are somewhat lighter, but if you actually open that in a 3D software, you'll see that this is not a very good displacement map. What we need is a better distinction between those tiles or those themes and the actual tiles. So how can we achieve that? That's actually quite easy. Hide this layer. Well, you don't need to hide it, but this makes it easier to see what we're doing. Go back to your original color layer and then go to colors, components, decompose. Now here we have the option to basically split up the image into its individual channels. Now right here you can see it's set to RGB, red, green and blue, but that's actually not what we're going to use. We're going to switch this to hue, saturation and value, which you might know if you use Blender a lot or other 3D or video editing software. It's not super common, but what it basically means, hue stands for the color, saturation basically how intense the color is, how saturated it is, and value, that's basically whether it is very light or very dark. But you'll see the effect of this in just a second. You can keep this checkmark on decompose to layers. Just click OK, let it chew through this, and we get this, which is of course beautiful. We also get the saturation map, which is maybe useful, right? But not for our purposes. And we get the value map, which is basically just a black and white copy of this image. But again, the part that's interesting for us is the hue map, because as you can see, while those have very different values, some of those parts here are very dark. Some of those parts here in the seam are very light, the hue is fundamentally different because this is all somewhat reddish or brown, and this is all somewhat maybe bluish. It's obviously not very saturated, so it's hard to tell, but it's probably bluish or maybe greenish. And therefore, we get this beautiful separation from the tiles and the seams between them. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select this entire layer, press Ctrl C, then move back to the original image because the decomposing thing created a new one. So just move back to the original and paste that. And again, it pasted it as a floating selection, so just add that as a new layer. Now if we zoom in on our new beautiful tile map, you could call it, you'll see that it's actually not that perfect because there are a few, like, what would you call them, glitches, or a few white dots in here. And in general, this is extremely bland. There's not a lot going on with the displacement in here. You'll see there are lots of artifacts, so that's not very detailed. But we have a detail map. It's the black and white copy of our color layer. You can see that still has all of its beautiful details. So we'll basically need to combine them. How do we do that? First of all, go back to your pasted layer, to your black and white map of the tiles, and we'll now need to apply several filters to them. We'll start with just a blur. That's because we have the sharp lines in our color copy, in our black and white color map, but we then need the map, as I will call them, to create these large scale displacements between the seams. So this is basically the fine detail and this is the large scale. But as you can see, it's much too sharp. This would be a very extreme drop off, and it's a bit too noisy, like that. And it's inverted. So we'll need to apply two filters. Filter number 1, colors, invert. That's simple. It will just invert all of the colors, and we now have a proper displacement because obviously the seams need to be darker than the tiles themselves. The second one is a blur, a Gaussian blur. You can experiment with the strength of this. For the tutorial, I think I'll use, or during the preparation, I used something like 24, 25. So just let it chew through this. And now you can see we have our blurred, large scale displacements and our very fine displacements. Okay, we are almost done because there's one thing I would like to fix. As you can see, this theme is not really black, and therefore if we were to use it as a displacement map, we wouldn't actually use the full color spectrum that's available. So to fix that, just go to the colors, curves, and just move that along until all of the parts are actually dark. But make sure that you don't overdo it, because then you'd clip some textures here. So if I were to do this really extreme, yeah, like so, you'd see that we would turn all of this in just one solid black color, and that's not what we want. We want a smooth gradient that's just a little bit darker than what we currently have. Yeah, like so maybe. So just confirm that. And now we basically only need to combine the two. And for that, I'm going to use the easiest process imaginable. I'm just going to go to my pasted layer and decrease the opacity. And now you can see we have a combination of the details, which are now really subtle. They don't take a lot of effect because we have our pasted layer on top of them with an opacity of like 70%, but they're still visible, so you can see all those details. But on the other hand, if we zoom out, we have a nice, very clear, large-scale displacement that will work in our 3D scene. So right now, we can actually start exporting that. One thing you might want to do, that's personal preference, but what I like to do is actually make the entire image perfectly squarish. Like if you go up here, you can see that it has a size of 5,700 and something versus 5,700 and something slightly different. So that's probably fine, but many software or many different software like to have a perfectly squarish textures. So just go to image, scale image, there it is, that was what I was looking for, scale image, and just change the width to something like, I don't know, I like to use 4096, it's a power of 2, it's very convenient. Remove that little link here, and again 4096. That will just put it in a sort of standardized size that's likely to be accepted by any software. Like so. Now we can export this as a texture. So create a new folder. I'll just call this 4K PNG, and just export this as like tiles tutorial displacement.png. I'm going to decrease the compression level to make saving faster. And while we're on it, I'm also going to export my color map. So just hide those layers and export as. Now this time we are obviously going to call that color. Okay, 2 maps are done, 2 maps are left to go. So, first of all, rename all of your layers to keep track of what you're doing. So this would be displacement fine, this would be displacement raw, because that's the very fine detail, and this is just the raw large scale displacement. Okay, so now let's move on to the roughness. Now the roughness is usually quite simple. For this texture I'm just going to make a copy of our fine displacement. I'm just going to call that roughness, and I'll make some adjustments to it using the color curves. Now if you're doing this, you need to think about the roughness of the material that you're trying to capture. So in my case, these tiles, they are somewhat glossy, but not really glossy. So I'm going to choose a roughness value that's somewhere in the middle. Right now, the seams in between, they're going to be extremely rough. So I'm going to choose a very high roughness value for them. So just go to your colors and select curves. And first of all, I'm just going to pull that side down and this side up, so it's inverted. Now this already looks quite good. I want the seams to be a bit more rough, so I'll just adjust it like that. Yeah, but I also want the tiles to be a bit less rough, so maybe like so. You can experiment with that value again. Yeah, but I think that's good. I'm going to keep this. And very quickly, we have finished with one more map. Export as tiles roughness. Okay, now onto the final map. For that, I'm going to move down the roughness all the way to the bottom so that displacement raw and displacement fine are right on top of each other, because now we need to create the normal map. So the normal map is basically generated out of the displacement map. But one thing that I like to do in here is just slightly decrease the opacity for our raw displacement, because then we get a bit more detail, which is good for a normal map, because many people like to use a displacement and a normal map together so that they have the large scale displacement that would come from the displacement map, and then they add a normal map for the very fine displacement, so that they can save on geometry and they don't need to make as many subdivisions to accommodate for all of the information in the displacement map. So just decrease your displacement map a little bit, not too much, we don't want to overdo it. So I just had this at 70, and maybe I'll just set this to like 55, that seems good, 56. And then I'm just going to merge that down. That's important, because in order for the normal map transformation to work, we need to have this in one layer. So displacement, then make sure that it's selected and go to filters, map, and now since you've installed this normal map add-on in the beginning, you should now see the option normal map. Click on it. It's going to give you this window, and this window contains a button that says 3D preview, which is going to give you another window. So it should look something like this. And if you look really closely, then you can already see that there's something going on this plane. Or maybe it will be like a sphere for you. I don't know what's the default setting on this one. I like to use the quad. That's just the plane. So now you can adjust your normal map. First of all, so that we can actually see what we're working with, I like to change the diffuse map to our color map down here, so that we can actually see the texture. And I like to enable specular lighting, because that will give us this really bright dot that we can use to check the normal map. Now in this window here, that's our actual settings window for the normal map. Now by default it's set to for sample, which works fine. It gives you a normal map, but what I like to do is change it to pre-width 5x5, because the normal map that's generated from that is usually a bit stronger, as you can see there. Now just move in, and if you zoom in all the way, you can see that we get a lot of detail. You can see all those little bumps in there, but we can also clearly see that the seams between the tiles are represented very well. If you think that this is too strong, you can adjust the scale here. So maybe I'll just tune that down to something like 0.85 maybe. If you've done that, just wait for a second. It will update like this. And if you think that this looks good, just click OK. And it will create your normal map. So there it is. The last map to save, export as tiles normal. Like so. And now if we go to our folder, to our texture folder, you can see that we now have 4 material maps for our tile texture. We have the seamless color, we have the displacement, we have the normal, and we have the roughness map. And there we have it. This is what our material looks like when we render it out. I hope this was interesting to you. I hope you learned something. If you don't feel like creating every single texture yourself, you can visit my website, CC0Textures.com, which has a continuously growing library of completely free PBR textures that you can use for all of your projects. You can also support this project on Patreon, or follow CC0Textures on Twitter to get a new texture in your feed every day. Until next time, see ya.